Oh, good, great. Good afternoon, welcome everyone. Welcome to today's celebration of our best friend Richard. My name's Andy Caughey and I'm the son of Richard's sister Jill, and I refer to him as my great Uncle Richard, as in great. And I'm in the privileged position of being MC today to set the scene for today's celebration of our Richard and the fun-filled life he shared with all of us in creating wonderful memories. And for those unable to travel, for Liz in Massachusetts and the Palethorpes, the Brodies, Nicks and Matthews, and the absent nieces and nephews, but they are joining us in spirit from around the world. As you all know, Richard was the youngest of 4 siblings raised by Russell Matthews and Mary Brodie at Tupari in New Plymouth. Richard was proud of his Scottish roots, as you can see from the memorabilia around the house, and this was cultivated from an early age through the love and care and attention of his mother, Mary. Granny Mary recalled how when Richard was a wee fella, he cut his leg, of which it was bleeding, and he said, "Is that good, Mum? Is that good blood, Mum? Is it Scotch?" Richard insisted he was all Brodie and all Scottish, or was it Scotch? Today, Seng, Stuart and I proudly wear our kilts. I'm wearing the Brodie tartan in honour of Richard's mother's lineage. Mary Brodie and the family roots link back to the seat of Clan Brodie and the stately Brodie Castle in Morayshire, Scotland. It was on this day 31 years ago that the 4 siblings, Elizabeth, Jill, John and Richard, visited Brodie Castle and met with Brodie of Brodie, the clan chief.
Eccentric. Runs in the family.
Genetic.
Was he in a tent on the wall?
Yeah.
Brodie Castle was where I proposed to my wife Alison, and it was on this occasion that we reunited the 4 siblings to Inverness for our wedding, bringing the Brodie bunch back to their ancestral roots. Richard was the youngest of the 4 siblings. Sister Liz was the eldest and 14 years older than Richard. Liz has the strong Matthews genes of high energy and determination, which were all apparent in Grandpa Russell. Liz, with my mother Jill, took care of Richard when he was very young, especially when Gran was poorly. Liz and Richard and their lives have crossed over the years at family gatherings or en route to Europe for Richard's antique buying trips. Today, Liz lives in Upton on the outskirts of Boston, and she has recorded a special eulogy, which we're about to hear, about Richard.
Hi everyone, I'm Liz Benney, and I'm so glad to be with you all, but it's only in spirit on this memorable occasion, as I live just outside of Boston, and it's about 40 degrees. You're 40 degrees here today with thunderstorms, so I hope we finish this. It's now July 2023, and my kid brother Richard has so sadly just left us. What a successful life he led after a very tough start. Jill and I remember it all so well. We're sitting on the sofa in the drawing room at Tupari, and the phone rings. "Well, girls, you have a new little brother. Dad doesn't sound very excited. Why?" In his next breath, he announced so quietly, "Your mother has just been rushed to the chest block of the hospital. She is out of remission. The beastly tuberculosis is back." He is quiet for a moment. "Don't wait up for me, girls." And I can remember where I was sitting and where Jill was sitting, and I remember saying, did Mum get to see Richard?" We had already given him a name. Briefly. "Did she get to hug him?" "No." And Dad hangs up. And on that day, the 25th of March, 1947, poor Richard was tossed from caregiver to family members, variously all over the North Island. Sometimes he came to see at Tupari, and Jill and I looked after him. How proficient we became at feeding the baby and changing nappies. I was 14 and Jill was 12, and a little brother, 7-year-old John, was often in and out of different homes and sometimes back with us to also take care of him at Tupari. The years flew by, and Richard was 5 years old. Mother was finally cured of the tuberculosis. At last, with a miracle drug called streptomycin. There was actually another one about the size of a half crown that she had to swallow, but I forget the name. It was very Latin. How she appreciated being back home, but she was unable to do much other than rest. Still, her presence gave us all such a sense of normalcy, and she started filling in the many empty gaps in Richard's early childhood. He did have a remarkable survivor's instinct. And so Richard grew into such a good-looking little boy with a huge personality, but academically, he showed less and less signs of proficiency. Yes, Richard was a wag and so good-looking. He was full of mischief too, but after a few years, his schoolwork had almost come to a standstill. Mother and Dad were so worried. Was Richard worried? No way. Mother found an excellent lady to try and get the kid up to scratch in reading and arithmetic. I can't recall her name, but she was such a sweet old soul, very physically handicapped, and she lived near the cenotaph in the middle of town. Did she help Richard? Nobody really knows. He could talk his way into any positive situation or reason for not reading or coping with sums, and I'm sure all of you have experienced moments like that. Finally, Mother and Dad decided to send Richard to a boarding school, a spot where hopefully good discipline and an atmosphere of learning. Richard was very bored at Lindisfarne, which was in Hastings, and way on the other side of the North Island from New Plymouth. And it's hard to believe, but Mother let him take his old motorbike. At first, he hid it in some bushes in a park near the school. Later, he charmingly got an old lady to let him store it in her garage. You can just see him chatting her up, you know. To hear Richard recount one of the bike stories is hilarious. Here is one of them. Hiding their school uniform beneath civilian clothes, Richard and a friend went out riding the motorbike. Oh, so forbidden, of course. They came across the headmaster driving his car and had a grand time weaving around the vehicle and showing off. The next morning in assembly, the head asked that the two boys on motorbike that had bothered him, they were to confess. He had seen the red regulations socks the boys were wearing. After much deliberation, the confession spilled out and the consequences followed. However, being totally bored at boarding school, Richard began tinkering on the piano, and the end result was his marvelous, and I mean that so sincerely, ability to play anything, whether it was jazz to the classics, the latter in his own key, of course. Richard never learned to read a single note of music. Time passed. Richard made history by failing the school certificates 3 times. but he was excellent in his art. His art ability got him enrolled in art school for 4 years in Wellington. And did he graduate? No, but the staff adored him and admired his artist talents. So he was promoted every year until graduation, but there was no graduating. Dad didn't realize Dad had no more art school and still paid the fees for another year. How Richard partied and even bought a car. He also made money performing on the piano at restaurants, weddings, private parties. And I remember once he didn't remember what the Here Comes the Bride, how to play it, and he improvised, and the mother of the bride was absolutely livid. But by the time she'd had a few drinks, she was his best friend. But anyway, a year passed and the fun times were suddenly over. Dad had woken up to the reality of his squandering son and decided to send Richard to Australia to grow up, to get some responsibility. And also by then, Richard had started leading a more positive gay lifestyle. But thankfully at that time, in the more naive 1960s, Dad and Mother were very accepting. But Dad was very critical of Richard's lack of a productive future. Mother always had positive thoughts that the renegade would finally amount to something. By now, I was married and living in Boston, and really only got snippets of what was going on with Richard, Negatives from Dad, positives more or less from Mother. Well, life for Richard in Australia was miserable. He had a job in the blazing sun working on an airport runway. He boarded with a Greek couple that spoke little English and how he hated their meals. Saving money like mad, Richard finally bought a ticket back to New Zealand. With luck, he arrived at Tupari when Dad was hosting a large party. The astonishment on Dad's face and the joy on Mother's face. Retribution would wait until later in the evening. By then, Dad had simmered down from a very successful evening. He took Richard's future in his hands and introduced him to an Irish antique dealer, Mary Allison. My word, did she teach him so much. And he also coupled up with Murdoch, who we all adored, and still do. Murdoch, you're one of the best, and you've been a lifelong friend of Richard. When Dad met Murdoch, his eyes lit up. Murdoch had long hair. You're a girl, stated Dad. Eventually, Richard opened an antique store in Hamilton, and how well he did. I visited him there on one of my trips down under. I remember being shocked that he had a very old, non-working washing machine for sale. Why did you ever buy this? I asked him. Oh, Liz, just wait a bit, he said to me, and he sold it for good money to a museum fairly soon after that. The time had now come for Richard to take his antique business to Auckland. Murdoch soon started his own very successful antique business in Auckland, and Richard started his latest venture with his new partner, Seng. Richard also bought a stunning old building in Remuera, the street soon becoming like London's Bond Street. Life couldn't have been better, except for the start of the beastly Parkinson's disease. We had noticed his odd shaking of the hands way back when Richard was in his 30s, but we all decided it was from too much fun partying. Who knows? But Richard and Seng coped well with his growing disability. And with the help of the shop's employee, Joan, well, she's dead now, so I can say these things. She was pretty good, but a wee bit of a snob. Actually, hearing it from Richard, she was a very big snob, and she liked to boast about her family's hoity-toity accomplishments. I squirm at that, but anyway, when Dad was knighted and Mother became Lady Matthews, Joan liked people to think that she was Richard's mother. Richard could have been on the stage with his imitations of Joan, but she was an asset to the business, and the lovely building had an apartment for the boys who live upstairs. How I loved to stay at the shop, and how I furnished much of Dave's in my Massachusetts home with antiques from Remuera. Yearly, Richard and Seng flew to England to purchase antiques for their Auckland shop. One year I accompanied Richard and couldn't believe the junk he was purchasing. You wait, Liz, he said. Wait until my restorer in Auckland has made all these bits and pieces so quickly saleable. And what an education I kept on getting. I saw the remarkable changes with my own eyes. The boys finally decided to get their own country home and purchase Nurse Hill. Everyone here knows the stunning home and with exceptional garden that the boys designed with the help from a famous New Plymouth-born landscaper working in England, and how Nurse Hill was nothing when they purchased it, but they both saw their new home with such a potential. There is really no need to ask me to talk about the increasingly beautiful, there's no need to talk for me about the increasingly brutal Parkinson's disease and the major operation to put electrodes into Richard's head to help him with his disability. And the operation did help for quite a long time. Richard's neurologist told him he was going to be the first to be given the operation in New Zealand. Before, Parkinson's parents were always sent to Brisbane, which of course is in Australia. Richard asked his doctor, "Who's going to hold the manual, Doc?" And he never lost his sense of humor. But as everyone knows, the entire team came over from Australia, and the operation was a very, very, very successful one. Richard remembered telling me that there was only standing room only in the operation room. Throughout it, Richard was always conscious, and the surgeons had to be sure not to cut any vital parts of the brain. It could leave the patient impaired in many directions. The hospital crew started asking, "Where are you, Richard?" "Auckland, New Zealand." And the same question was asked over and over again. "Where are you, Richard?" "Auckland again." "Where are you, Richard?" This time he cracked up the room. "New York, New York." Oh, Richard's brilliant sense of humour. At one point, he said that drilling through the skull, the smell reminded him of Seng's barbecue dinner. Today, there's no point in describing the tough last few months of Richard's disability. Seng has asked me not to mention how he kept Richard happy and comfortable and much, much more, and I will respect his request. But I'm going to say how much we all admire and love you, Seng, and don't ever disappear from our lives. I think I've left something out. No. And Richard, how could we ever forget our vivid memories of you? We will always love and remember you forever. So I'll be thinking of you all on the 30th, and I wish I could be with you. That's it. Bye, everybody.
I spoke with Liz this morning, and she would very much love to have been here today with us all. She's got lasting memories of her last trip here to Nurse Hill, and she asked Richard if he would play a final tune on the piano, and we have a recording of that last request while Liz was here.
Brother Richard on the piano. Fabulous, good job.
We have two cool uncles, John with all the toys, boats, hang gliders, tanks, things to have fun with. Brother John was the engineer, the practical one, who loved working with cars, returning home smelling of petrol and bitumen. And this must have influenced Richard's love of motors, not engines, but fast-moving cars. John fueled Richard's need for speed with his crazy antics around fast boats and fast cars to create Richard, the first petrol head. Catch me if you can. A comment as relevant to cops as it was for Russell chasing Richard around the house.
That's right. You're right.
John, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm a bit slower than I was, and this is a new event for me over the last few weeks. And I have a form of dementia, you ought to know, and it's hit me like a train running over me. So it's probably part of the family process, and for those colleagues of mine in the family who've got the same impact, wish you well. So I'll be making speeches for as long as I'm alive, so don't think that this is necessarily a short event. I'm going to give you some anecdotes about Richard, who I loved hugely and still do love hugely. Ever since the time, for those of you who have been to Tupari, ever since the time we hurtled down the hill at Tupari to the bottom paddock at colossal speed on a cart. I built the cart and I was the driver, and Richard was the courageous passenger. He'd hang on to me. There was evidence of this process, because frequently we would run into something and both end up with bleeding noses and so on. But that was all part of the process of having thrills, which later translated, of course, into motor vehicles rather than carts. And in those days, some of you will know, there were others, young people with me, Gilbert Muir, Wilfred Price, Tommy Banscoves. They all hung on to me in the back of this cart, and I would be the driver with a great deal of pride in my abilities to go around these corners sideways and on down the hill. I had a dog. I was crazy on dogs, and I was finally allowed to have a dog, a Cocker Spaniel, and called Tommy. No, Cocker Spaniel called Bobby. And Bobby and I were best of friends, and he slept in a dog kennel that was half outside, half inside. And this was the beginning of the difficulties Richard and I had on occasions, because I really loved the Bobby, the Spaniel, and so did Richard. And so we both tried to get in this kennel, which was an outside one, together, and Richard always won. And so the result was that Richard ended up hanging on to Bobby, and I was left sort of on the outside of the tent. But our father was incredibly autocratic, and those of you who knew him, you would know what I mean. A difficult man, and well-meaning, and did some amazing things in life. Pukeiti Rhododendron Trust and Tupari, which is now considered to be one of the 6 major homes in New Zealand, and so on. And he was the driving force for that, but a very difficult person to live with. And my brother Richard was the recipient of a lot of my father's difficulties in relating to people. Our mother, however, was an angel. I promised not to have a problem with this.
Okay. Take your time. Take your time. Yeah. We understand. We're talking about Bobby and why he had to go.
So Richard was the recipient of the difficulties of the relationship between my father and himself. And for those of you, almost everybody here who knew Richard, he was extraordinary the way he overcame the family difficulties that he faced. He was shipped off to Lindisfarne, a school, boarding school in Auckland, in the Hawke's Bay, and I was shipped off just around the corner, so it didn't affect me, to the New Plymouth Boys High School, which was a dreadful place as well. Terrible. As recipients of the bad things that happened to us at that school and at Lindisfarne, it's one of the tragedies of New Zealand, in my view, that we have yet to grow up in this world of looking after each other. But my mother was the angel, and she was the glue in the family, and she held us all together. And Richard went to Lindisfarne, as I said, and I went to New Plymouth Boys High School. But I was privileged by being at the home to be able to quietly cheat and borrow the car. Mother, and this was a Bentley, so this was some vehicle. This was a vehicle of consequence, And I would borrow this car when nobody was looking, including my mother. And Richard would pile in, and off we'd go together. And it was a great event. But however, my brother Richard steamed into the garage that this Bentley was looked after and kept in, and ploughed through the vehicle, through the building, and out the other side. Was a hell of a crash. And my father then heard about this, and you could see the damage I could see the damage. It was pretty bad. But my father had decided that it was Mother who had had the accidents. So he was saying I heard my father say to my brother Richard, look, take it easy with your mother, Lynda, not Lynda, excuse me, Lynda. Take it easy with your mother, Mary, because she's not driving very well at the moment. And if you look at the Bentley, you'll see, I mean, it was a real mess, the Bentley. So that's the way we were back then. And Richard, I helped Richard buy an incredible vehicle. And I felt so proud of Henry Ford, because this was a Ford Galaxy V8 engine, one of those turtle backs, if you remember, those of you who remember back then. But it was a vehicle with a great sweeping back, and it had extraordinary performance as a V8. It's something that Henry Ford would have been hugely proud of. And Richard and I would escape from Tupari in this massive vehicle and go to Wellington or somewhere. Richard knew where all the parties were. I was the, I was the driver, and Richard was the passenger. I was proud of you, Richard. I'm still proud of you. You were terrific in those days, helping me get through these cities. You were the adult and I was the kid. And we went to Arrow Street. So this vehicle was huge, this Ford V8 vehicle of Henry Ford's, as it were. I can vividly recall Richard taking me through Wellington, and we went to Arrow Street. I'm not sure why, but because, of course, now they sell CDs and records. But anyway, we're in Arrow Street, and coming down the hill from Arrow Street was this quite a big vehicle, but we were going up, and it wasn't in Richard's mind to give way or to change directions, and Richard was driving, and I'm a sitting passenger watching him drive up Arrow Street, looking at the car coming down, and we merged bumpers, and Richard then said, "Hang on," and he pushed. My brother pushed this other car all the way up Arrow Street. It was going backwards. We were going forwards, and the driver of the other vehicle was, out of control, was rags. I was so. It was. Yes, thanks, Seng. I was so proud of my brother. I'm still proud of him, and I still love him, and I have these memories of these challenges that we had. We called that one the Arrow Street Challenge. And then I had the pleasure of helping Richard buy a place. Really, when you think about it, Seng, it was pretty awful. But anyway, for us it was something special, and that was a frontage onto the main street of Hamilton, where Richard built the first antique business, and he did an extraordinary job. And Seng, I can't remember where you were at that stage. Where did you?
Baby.
Okay. I was so proud of my brother. This was an antique shop, the first in the Wairarapa, and hugely successful. And Richard ran it all himself. He really invented it himself, and it became very popular and very well known. And that was the beginning of this process, because Richard then purchased the beautiful building in Remuera. And for those of you who remember, it was Remuera Antiques. My brother owned that building and built that business there. Extraordinary, one of the best in New Zealand, if not the best. And again, Richard, I'm so proud of you for what you achieved there. And following that, Seng, now I'm coming right up to date. You and Richard purchased, what do we call this place? Nurse Hill.
Yep.
I want to just mention a little anecdote, because when we were with my father and mother and we were driving around New Zealand in the Bentley, and incidentally I felt so embarrassed about the Bentley because it was one hell of a car. Is Glyn here?
Yes.
Is Glyn with? Here's Glyn. Did you come in it?
Not that one, another one.
Glyn Williams is extraordinary. You know, here he is. He's very unashamed, and he's got all these Bentleys, and the last time I saw him, which was a few weeks ago, he was buying another one from the UK. This is a huge car. Has it arrived?
Oh, yeah, that's all right. Oh, the Bentley's a few years ago. That was a modern one.
Yeah, I'm talking about the modern ones. So Richard and Glyn and Seng were standouts, because here they were driving around impoverished Hamilton and elsewhere, Auckland, with this extraordinary motor car worth a fortune. And I don't know if there's a little anecdote for those who remember, because we sat in this car with my father driving, and to break the boring parts of the journey, we would have this little ditty, which was that one you might remember. Ours is a nice house, ours is. A nice little house, ours is. The front's at the front and the back's at the back, and the roof's on the top of this dear little shack. Oh, ours is a nice house, ours is. It's got no rats or mouses. It's sweet, 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 and it's cheap, cheap, cheap. Ours is a nice house, ours is. And that was my brother driving in a Bentley. I want to thank some people here who were close to my brother for their support and their love for him. And that's Glyn Williams, John Mains, Seng, Annie Webb, Lynda and Grant Walter, and it's Hello Loving Lynda, and With a Bump Annika, and Roland, and Damien, and my sister Elizabeth, and Sarah and Luke, and Isabella and Dahlia and Catalina. So this is our family, and Rosa. This is a family that we all knew and grew up with. And it's goodbye, Liz. Sometime soon. It's an inevitability, and I'm getting ready for it, together with myself. And it's goodbye, Jill. And that's a reality. And it's goodbye to our mother Mary, the glue in the family. And it's goodbye for the person that we're assembled here today, which is my brother Richard. That's it for me, folks. Oh, I forgot Murdoch. Murdoch's here tonight. If you're near Murdoch sometime today, give him a hug, please.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, John. Thank you. Moving speech. And thank you for acknowledging your sister Jill and my mother and John's wife. Jill, my mother and Richard's second sister in age, only passed away 9 months ago, at the end of October. Richard and Jill were very close, sharing many personal stories and taking comfort in each other's company with long calls over the phone. Jill and my father John loved Richard's company, his wit and ability to tell stories, how to make the mundane interesting, with a few embellishments and exaggerations permitted along the way. Don't we all love Richard's stories? Over the last few years during COVID lockdown, when travel was prohibited, we connected Richard and Seng with John and Jill through Facebook Messenger, and we would schedule these video calls for 1 o'clock in the late afternoon for an hour of banter before dinner. What a noise! The raucous laughter that came from the conservatory at Wanaka and the deck at Nurse Hill, of stories being told. These calls were an uplift for Jill and Richard as they both battled their own personal health issues. Jill and Richard were great family connectors, and they have a shared interest in keeping in contact with family members around the world. Mum's handmade greeting cards and Richard's phone calls, visits and hosting kept the family connected with the Brodies, Nicks, Palethorpes and Matthews. Nick, Peter and Sally Ann Palethorpe in Australia would love to have joined us today for today's celebration, but the pressure of today's Bledisloe rugby game between Australia and New Zealand would have been too stressful for them. So they've sent us the following recording. Here's some thoughtful words from Nick and Peter Palethorpe.
Hello everybody, I am Nick Palethorpe. This is my older and occasionally wiser brother Peter. We also have two sisters, Sarah and Jane, who would love to be here today but couldn't be. We first met Richard in Auckland in 1950. He would then have been but a youngster. Since then, we have regularly crossed the ditch to keep in touch with him and our many New Zealand cousins. As we all know, Richard, with much assistance from Tonya in his book, To Whom It May Concern, wrote up his many escapades. We have been rereading these adventures the last few weeks, and they've come back to life in vivid colour. Always honest, always fun, always original, and proudly who he was. In his early 20s, Richard, not being a natural scholar, was banished to do time in Australia with us convicts. Whilst here, he worked in a factory owned by his uncle Stuart. Wrote Richard in his book, "In the end, my only sanity was visiting the Palethorpes." He was to be a frequent visitor, often with Murdoch, and it was during these visits our lifelong family bonds were cemented. Nigel Palethorpe, our father, had married Anne Brodie, Mary Matthews' sister, and having met Anne years later, Richard wondered in his book, why did it take Nigel so long, a whole day, before he proposed to Anne? Richard continued. Walter Brodie, our mutual grandfather, on being told of the young couple's intentions to marry, took Nigel into the garden and told him, "Nigel, the first thing you do in the morning is clear your tubes." It was never quite clear which tubes, added Richard. Nigel was marvellous to me, wrote Richard, as was Nan, his second wife, our mother Anne having passed away some years earlier. Over now to brother Peter.
Thank you, Nick. There are now 4 Palethorpe siblings, Peter, Nick, Jane and Sarah. Nick's younger sister, Sarah, was a bridesmaid at Nick at his wife Sally Ann's wedding. On the morning of the wedding, Sarah warned Sally Ann that Nick had a bad habit of clearing his tubes every morning. This bad habit continued. We lot now have between us some 11 kids. All of them have stayed over the years with Richard and Seng. Extraordinarily hospitable, nothing was ever too much trouble. We all were frequent visitors to Nurse Hill. Sadly, due to age and ill health, none of us could make it across the ditch today, but we hope to have Seng stay with us in a few weeks. And finally, Seng, what a wonderful partner you were to Richard, keeping him going all these years, and both of you filling our hearts and minds with so many glorious memories. As Uncle Jack Brodie wrote in one of his books, it is only when you stop talking and writing about people that they are really dead. Bye-bye for now.
Murdoch met Richard in the early 70s and travelled extensively in pursuit of the next precious piece that could be retrieved from an attic, be dusted off and polished to perfection, to become the most rare and endangered period piece of the time. Yes. Lynda, we met briefly when I was a boarder at King's, when Richard would whisk me away on leave Sunday for a tour around Auckland, visiting friends and restoration shops with long lunch over a sneaky lunch before returning me back to boarding school.
The good old days.
Yes, so hand it over to you first,
Okay,
Lynda.
you go first.
Often people wonder where gay people meet. This is a wee bit of this. Can I just get you out? Okay.
Wonderful start.
Well, fortunately, I can say in this particular instance, I'm very proud to say that I can read out some really authentic notes. In February 1970, aged 20, I arrived in Auckland on an NAC flight from Dunedin. I had landed in Auckland full of trepidation about what was going to happen next. As the airport bus drove in those days to the city via Queen Street Onehunga, I thought, what the hell have I done? Suburban Dunedin was far more glamorous than this. I didn't discover Queen Street, Auckland, until a week later. Anyway, the reason for my journey was completely on a whim, after a remark made to me in the Dunedin antique shop where I worked. This remark was made by Peter Webb, who owned Cordy's, an antique auctioneering business in Auckland. If you are ever in Auckland looking for a job, do get in touch. So naively, taking this as a fait accompli, I arrived at his business completely unannounced. To his and my horror, he explained that he had already given the job of junior to someone else. Guess who? Peter Webb went on to say that he was busy, but he felt that at least he could get the new boy to take me to lunch. So off we went to the newly appointed Intercontinental Hotel, where Richard floored me completely by ordering a Bloody Mary. "Where are you staying?" he asked, as we tottered back to his work. "The People's Palace," I said. "That's funny," he replied. "It's in Wellington." "I'll see if my landlady has a spare room." The landlady was a buxom Scotswoman, and on hearing my name said, "Of course, he can come here." What a relief. However, that relief was short-lived, as she threw us out when she found my pillow in Richard's bed. Remember, it's 1970 and the Homosexual Law Reform Act was not passed until 1986. So we began our life of crime, and for the next 10 years caused mayhem, confusion and amusement amongst the wider community. There was no hiding our light under a bushel, which I googled, and it's a proverb from the Sermon on the Mount. Gradually, we were accepted as opposed to tolerated. I would like to say at this point, the unconditional love of us both by our mothers is a memory I cherish. Finally, the two main things I would like to convey to Richard's memory is my eternal gratitude, and that beneath all his wit, charm and flippancy, there was an abiding courage. most of all, he had the courage to be himself. Thank you. Okay. Okay. I get...
Just a quick explanation that Seng has asked me to do on the invitations. You saw it said bar closed, old chap, and a lot of you will know that expression, but a lot of you won't. And it started from when Richard was at our house in the early 80s, and of course he finished his glass first, and in order to get attention he banged his glass on the table and said, "Bar closed, old chap!" So I can still hear him saying it. So it's become part of our family folklore, it's part of the narrative whenever I talk about Richard. And he also loved me telling the story, so he'd be very pleased I explained it to you today. And now I have to speak very quickly because Seng said we have to be really quick with the speeches. I first met Richard in 1973. From the very first meeting, apart from being a fellow antique dealer, it was pretty obvious that we shared a lot in common. Ever since that memorable encounter, Richard was an important part of my life, as I'm sure he was to everyone here today and also probably many other people. Richard was always loyal, he was always fun and always extremely hospitable. He loved socialising and his natural gregarious nature made him a most desirable guest. He was the master of storytelling, which a couple of previous people have mentioned today, and he was an amusing raconteur. And it was sad to acknowledge that as Parkinson's took hold, he could no longer do this. However, he still loved to socialise right to the end, and instead of telling stories himself, he listened carefully to the stories of his guests, and he became the master of one word that conveyed everything. If you told him a funny story or something interesting, he would say, "Charming," or "Marvellous." And if it was a sad story, perhaps someone's ill health or something, he'd go, "Curtains." As you all know, Richard began and ended his career as a successful antique dealer, travelling overseas on frequent buying trips, exhibiting at antique fairs, attending many, many auctions, not only in Auckland but throughout the country and indeed the world. Wheeling and dealing was in his blood, and Richard always had a good eye for aesthetics. Instinctively, he could see something different or unusual and know that he could sell it, usually with an excellent profit margin. Oh, even before. I just loved the fact that a week before he died, Don Melville, who's another fellow antique dealer, and saw Richard and Seng at Caughey's auction sale, viewing the latest sale. Thanks to Seng, how wonderful that Richard was still able to participate in this lifelong interest of art and antiques, right to the end. I've learnt never to ask older people how they are. For certain you will be regaled with every ache and pain. The exception to this rule was Richard. The week before he died, I spoke with him on the phone and asked him, "How are you, Richard?" "I'm hanging in there," he said, and laughed, and that was that. He never, ever complained about the impact Parkinson's had on his life. I found this extraordinary and admired his stoicism enormously. And really, John alluded to the childhood, or told us about the child, and how he, again, that stoicism was obviously there right from the beginning. Richard and Seng purchased Nurse Hill in 1995, and for a number of years they commuted to the shop in Remuera. When the decision to shut the shop and move out to Nurse Hill permanently was made in 2003, I think all the friends were somewhat concerned. Richard, the social butterfly in the country, not sitting having coffee with every day with people in the shop, while Joan looked after it. Our fears were unfounded. His love of the garden, instilled so deeply into his psyche by Russell and Mary, came once again to the fore. You've only got to look around here and see what has been achieved. And in an unexpected positive consequence of the move, we all became the beneficiary of Seng's cooking skills. He went out of his way to ensure that Richard's social personality never went wanting. An invitation to lunch or dinner at Nurse Hill was always met with great excitement, and I'm sure others would agree it was a huge treat to be able to come here and enjoy Seng's wonderful food.
I have something to say. We have once somebody came in, I don't know who,
Yeah.
at 12 and never ate.
At what?
8.
And never ate. No, never 8 o'clock at night.
Oh! I'd obviously been drinking a lot.
No, keep going.
Hospitality extended by Richard and Seng was unsurpassed. They were always generous hosts, although there was just one occasion when Richard chastised Seng for cooking the broccoli with Tanqueray gin instead of using Gordon's. Richard said that being at Nurse Hill was the happiest time of his life. Seng insisted I did not mention him, but I have ignored that because how can you talk about the last 30 plus years of Richard's life and not mention Seng? We all know your love for him was unwavering and at times, frankly, against all reasoning. And so on behalf of Richard and everyone dear to him, all I'm going to say to you, Seng, are you listening? Is that you were the best partner Richard could ever have wished for, and I believe he knew that. Finally, they say a friend is one who knows you and loves you just the same. We love you, Richard, and you have left a hole in the fabric of my life and those who knew you. Let us remember you as the tall, blonde, handsome, fun dude that you were. I know that is how you would like to be remembered. Richard, you will be sorely missed by all your family and friends.
Spent some wonderful times at Tupari with Murdoch and Richard over the summer months. Running down the hill in Tupari, stubbing our toes, going swimming in the pool, and just summers of great relaxation with all our cousins from around the world. Tupari was also where Murdoch first met my sister Philipa. Philipa, or Pip as she's known, spent time with Richard speeding down the hawthorn lanes of England in search of special antiques to bring back to New Zealand. And Pip wrote a very special poem for Richard for his 75th birthday, which she's going to read out to us today.
I'll just read this with a wee postscript at the end. Wow, 75 years. 75 years ago, exactly today, bonny wee Richard was on display. This beautiful babe to Barrett Street came at last. Elizabeth, Jill and John came with Russell so fast. The nurses and angels tended to him there. For 3 months he stayed and received love and care. For his mummy was isolated at the Sand for TB. What a joyous reunion when together finally. This wee Manny was christened when he was just young with blessed water from the Jordan River. A long way it had come. We know you've been watched over in your life to this day, and a decision will take you to heaven, come what may. Uncle Richard was always the uncle with a grin, and we loved every time that we met up with him. Kauai fishing off the coast with the uncles, caught a ton, or at Tupari with the cousins, or a swim in the sun. I was so privileged to be in the UK in '87. A coincidence? No, it was arranged up in heaven, for we met up and travelled and talked incessantly as we drove the south of England, Uncle Richard and me. What's the trade, he would ask after we'd ventured in, to a treasure trove of junk. No, let the hunt begin. His acute eye would peruse and settled on his score, and we'd walk out with the precious piece and maybe even more. How exciting to see how then it was transformed from a dusty old relic to one not to be scorned, polished and buffed up till it glowed with pride, attracting much attention, drawing shoppers inside. I loved that trip with Richard, finding antiques for New Zealand, a treat to remember and a treasure unplanned. Devonshire tea in the bathhouse, and with John Caughey we dined, in the Manor House dining room with laughter, food and flowing wine. You've amazing artistic skills, blade, brush and paint to create, and you unfolded treasures for us, your niece and nephews, to then take. A tree for me, a ship for Andrew, and for Bernard, big machinery. On our bedroom walls, a great reminder of you into eternity. Hamilton, Auckland, and then out to Nurse Hill. The beauty, the splendour, the peace and the still. The glorious growth from trained expert eyes brings admiration and wonder and joy-filled sighs. Richard and Seng, you are our treasures untold. Your caring so evident, your love so bold. Your generosity in all you give and share. I wish we lived closer, not far away, but near. We once again congregated for Jill's surprise 70th celebration, all guests duly notified by your fun, creative invitation. Such a fine time we had after Jill recovered from fright, and to the West Coast we trained, where we all spent the night. We loved your visits coming down to our farms as you explored for old relics hidden under trees and in barns, for the gifts that you've given to your great nephews and niece, a cool train set, Mac the dog, and beautiful top and dress piece. For you are so wonderful and I love you so dear. I love your company, your humour and your laughter so clear. Your mischievous smiles, your twinkling bright eyes, your mere tinkling on the piano is expert, I don't lie. There's always such laughter as stories unfold, like the truth that you shared with Neil and I was pure gold. Two brothers with flasks behind the marquee, drinking at our dry wedding, a dram 2 or 3. Seng, you and Richard make such a great team. Richard, I know you are blessed to have met Seng. Complementing each other in your various gifts, we are awed at your resilience in all the health shifts. Seng, the master chef of culinary delights, sweet and savoury sublime with colours so bright, floral arrangements perfection, all from the garden too. Housekeeping extraordinaire, you're amazing, it's true. Seng, your nursing skills are truly supreme, doing tasks of which you hadn't ever dreamed. You tirelessly give and care and then lovingly again, frequently neglecting your own back that gives pain. Your fairy friends so sweet and so lovable too, old Morris and now Willow to name but a few. The perfection of your decor each placed with precision, an eye for such quality, an expert decision. Richard, your body is tired, but your mind's rearing to go. No movement is measured. Go fast and not slow. So tall and so handsome, you took such great strides. Please wait and be patient for Seng to protect and to guide. Our beloved old Richard, yes sir, to Esther then, and to Ethan and Mark, a special great uncle and friend. We'd cherish our meetings, they were always so great, and we'd love and we'd laugh, and photos for memories we'd take. We love and we celebrate a life fully lived. Thank you for your unconditional love that you give. A huge hug we send and also prayers come your way, honouring you, Uncle Richard. Happy 75th birthday. Now, over a year later, we all gather at Nurse Hill, in the beauty and the splendour, even in winter a thrill. We honour and celebrate you, Richard, a life truly lived, and remember with such love all that you'd give. Your twinkle, that sparkle, that courageously flickered to the end, so trapped inside your body that was no longer your friend. You're free to laugh and dance and move with joy unleashed. In heaven above, Richard, your spirit now released. We don't mourn for you today as you've been set free, but grief is the price we pay for love, so we gather thoughtfully. And we give thanks for our partner, friend, great uncle and brother, now with your Maker in heaven, and your sister, nephew and mother. We love you, Richard.
Richard has always taken a deep interest in what we, the nieces and nephews, are up to, and our journeys in life, offering encouragement along the way, shared with his life experiences and our first insights into how to have a good party. To all of us, Richard was our first rock star. He was living and had lived the rock and roll dream. His drum kit, his love of music, the shirts, the flares, the medallions, complemented by the hairstyles and the outrageous stories of his life in London, set in the context of the Stones, the Who, Led Zeppelin, Queen, the music of London that still resounds with music lovers of today. The sedate world of antiques seemed in stark contrast to rock and roll. But Richard's appreciation of music also resonated with his way with words, which brought the wonders of antique pieces alive. History lessons on the boot, On our trips around antique stores, he taught us that value is more important than cost, that beauty could be interpreted and appreciated in so many different ways, and that a good story with intrigue and integrity could support the sale of any antique piece. Richard inspired all of us with a foundational knowledge and appreciation of design, colour, art, architecture, trees, antiques, food, wine, history, and family, some of which has been retained by more than others. I said 10 nieces and nephews, but in February this year, my brother Benney passed away at age 55 from a brain tumour. Richard's love of Benney, Rich and Benney were very close. Richard greatly inspired and influenced my brother Benney in his career pursuits and in the cultivation of his love of fine furniture, art and architecture. Benney was studying in Auckland in the late 80s and would come up and stay and visit with Rich and Seng, where they would talk for hours, sharing knowledge about design influences and furniture styles, the elegant use of wood, and the evolution of furniture over the ages. Richard provided Benney with career direction and encouragement, leading him to become an accomplished builder, craftsman and designer of furniture, anchored to those formative days at Nurse Hill. Richard, we are grateful for your involvement in Benney's life, and his memory lives on here in the craft work that is seen in the rooms at Nurse Hill today. Although the nieces and nephews are spread far and wide today, Spain, USA, Hong Kong, London and New Zealand, we are all thinking of Richard and his positive contribution to enriching our lives. Richard, we hold you close as a friend and as a great Uncle Richard. What a good time you gave us. Finally, Seng, thank you for your friendship and your love of Richard. Together, you have generously opened your doors to your home to host many a party at Nurse Hill, and today that tradition continues. We all have wonderful warm memories of Rich and Seng in Nurse Hill, delicious meals together, whether a long lunch on the terrace or a kitchen smells of your gourmet cooking permeating as we sit around the fire before dinner. Richard, your spirit is with us today in more ways than one. Let's raise a toast to Richard. To Richard. Three. Yes. Thank you.
I'm not sure if the show's over, but because I haven't been given anything else to do. But I really want to thank you all for participating in this meeting, this gathering today. Means a lot to me, and thank you. I'm sure. It also, of course, means a lot to all of us.
Absolutely. Cheers, John. Cheers, Johnny.